Ras Laffan. A name most people never say out loud until it becomes a line item in the world's risk premium. Because when a conflict reaches a major gas facility, it stops being a question of borders. It becomes a question of systems. And systems don't need to collapse to start charging everyone. They only need to look fragile. The Strait of Hormuz doesn't have to close, it only has to feel uncertain. That uncertainty travels faster than any missile. It becomes higher insurance, higher freight, rerouted shipping, more expensive fuel, more expensive food. Inflation imported into countries that never fired a shot. This is the decision that costs billions. Not the decision to talk. The decision to let energy infrastructure become part of the battlefield. They sound like industry jargon. They are not. They're the nodes that hold together an energy network the modern economy depends on. When those nodes become targets, or even look like plausible targets, markets don't wait for confirmation. They don't wait for a shortage. They reprice risk immediately. That repricing is how a regional conflict starts charging the entire planet, not in theory, on invoices, on shipping contracts, at the pump, at the supermarket. A war like this doesn't need to spread by speeches. It spreads by insurance policies and freight schedules. And once energy infrastructure is pulled into the conflict, the battlefield gets bigger than the map. To understand why this matters, you have to see the Gulf the way the world's logistics system sees it. Not as countries, as chokepoints and clusters. Energy supply isn't evenly distributed across a region, it's concentrated. Liquefied natural gas depends on specialized facilities, specialized ships, and predictable export cycles. Refining depends on complex plants that cannot be replaced overnight. Petrochemical hubs depend on stability and continuous operations. That concentration is efficient when the system is calm. It becomes a vulnerability when the system is threatened. Ras Laffan and Mesaieed. Gas becomes geopolitical. Ras Laffan in Qatar is one of those places that should never become a war keyword. It represents large-scale LNG capability, industrial output tied to contracts and global energy planning. When a site like that is mentioned in the context of attacks, the market hears a different message than damage. It hears, continuity is now uncertain. Mesaieed, also in Qatar, reinforces that idea. Another industrial cluster, another node that signals how much of the system is concentrated in a handful of places. The point isn't that one plant matters. It's that the network has too many dependencies on too few points. Hosn. Energy assets become security assets. In the United Arab Emirates, Hosn is a name that represents energy infrastructure, an installation connected to gas energy production. Once a conflict in the region starts interacting with energy assets, these sites stop being economic. They become strategic. That shift changes military posture, defense spending, air defense readiness, and the entire risk calculus around the country, even before anything is disrupted. Jubail and SAMREF. The refining bottleneck the public rarely sees in Saudi Arabia, Jubail symbolizes industrial concentration, petrochemicals processing, export capability, and the kind of scale that turns stability into a global assumption. But the most misunderstood vulnerability is refining. That's where SAMREF enters the story. The world talks about crude oil, but consumers buy refined products, jet fuel, diesel, gasoline. Refining is the step that converts barrels into daily life. When refining becomes a risk, the transmission to inflation becomes faster and more political. That's why energy being targeted is not one story. It's multiple stories layered into a single risk premium. And then there's the multiplier that sits just offshore. The multiplier that doesn't require closure. The Strait of Hormuz is not important because it must close. It's important because it can be threatened. In pricing terms, it behaves like this. If the strait looks stable, freight and insurance are priced as routine. If the strait looks unstable, the system pays an uncertainty tax. That tax appears before any physical blockade. It shows up when insurers raise premiums, when shippers demand higher rates, when cargo owners seek alternate routes, when governments start speaking in terms of securing navigation. A conflict that reaches this layer doesn't need to expand geographically to expand economically. It expands through cost. when energy is allowed into the target set. Here is the decision that changes everything, allowing energy infrastructure to be pulled into the conflict as a credible target. Sometimes it's explicit, an intentional strike. Sometimes it's indirect, operations that create a strong probability of energy disruption. Sometimes it's a threat that markets believe. But in each case, the result is identical. The conflict stops being contained. Because the moment energy becomes part of the battlefield, every neighboring government faces two pressures at once. First, protect its own critical infrastructure. Second, avoid becoming the next link in a chain of retaliation. And that is how wars recruit countries, not by formal declarations, by forcing states to act in self-defense, in airspace management, in maritime security, in economic crisis management. At that point, the question is no longer, who is fighting? It becomes, who is exposed? And exposure creates involvement. This is why the script says 12 countries enter the board, even though in reality, 2 or 3 more are pulled to the edge by the same mechanics. The number is a narrative frame. The system is the story. What follows is not a list of flags. It's a map of mechanisms. Each country is pulled in through a different doorway: direct risk, air defense, proximity, political structure, economic exposure, or logistics. 1. Qatar, Ras Laffan. Qatar enters the story at the moment Ras Laffan becomes associated with conflict risk. The market response is not subtle. LNG is contract-driven and logistics-heavy. It depends on stable operations and predictable export flows. When a site like Ras Laffan is treated as vulnerable, it doesn't just influence Qatar's outlook, it forces importers and traders to consider alternatives. And alternatives are rarely cheap, fast, or unlimited. The key consequence here is not a shortage today. It's that the system begins to behave as if a shortage is plausible. Prices move on plausibility. 2. Qatar, Mesaieed. Mesaieed adds a second layer to the Qatar story. When multiple industrial nodes are discussed in the same breath as escalation, the market's mental model changes. This is not a one-off. It could be sustained. That shift in perception is enough to raise risk premiums across the region. Not because every facility will be hit, because no one can guarantee that none will be hit. 3. United Arab Emirates, ALHOSN. In the UAE, Al-Hosn functions in the public narrative as a named example of energy infrastructure. The actual mechanism here is posture. Once a state has to treat energy assets as potential targets, it must adapt. Enhanced air defense readiness, increased surveillance and interception capability, broader security measures around production and transport. This has an economic cost and a signaling cost. The UAE's role becomes a major economic hub forced into a higher security equilibrium. Even if nothing is physically disrupted, investors and insurers price the environment differently. 4. Saudi Arabia, Jubail. Saudi Arabia enters the board in a unique way: scale. Jubail is the kind of industrial area that represents concentration and capability. When a conflict in the region touches energy, hubs like Jubail become part of global contingency planning. The mechanism is cascade risk. Industrial clusters are integrated systems. When stability is questioned, markets begin pricing not just energy supply risk, but broader industrial and export disruption. Even a small probability of cascading disruption can move prices because the downside is large. 5. Saudi Arabia. SAMREF brings the story down to the part consumers actually feel. Refining is where crude turns into fuel. When refining becomes a credible risk, the price signal shifts from future scarcity to immediate inflation exposure. Because refined products are the daily commodity. Diesel moves goods. Jet fuel moves people. Gasoline moves politics. If refining capacity is threatened, governments start thinking in terms of domestic pressure, not just international strategy. That's why refineries carry political gravity. 6. Kuwait's entry into the board is about geography and concentration. It sits in the Gulf environment where escalation risk is not theoretical. In a retaliation cycle, proximity becomes exposure. Kuwait doesn't need to be the centerpiece to be involved. It becomes involved because regional risk forces it to protect its own facilities, plan for supply disruptions, coordinate with allies on maritime and air security. Even a defensive stance is involvement when the system is tense. 7. Bahrain represents the small state version of the same reality. In escalations like this, the map compresses. Distances feel shorter, warnings feel louder. The mechanism here is association. Bahrain can be pulled in by regional posture shifts, defense needs, and the perception that the Gulf's stability is changing. And perceptions, once again, become pricing. 8. Jordan's entry is about airspace. In these conflicts, missiles and drones don't care about diplomatic language. They follow trajectories. That forces states like Jordan into operational roles: monitoring, interception, coordination, and risk management. This is why neutrality becomes complicated. Even if Jordan is not a primary actor, being under flight paths turns the country into part of the conflict's practical geography. 9. Iraq enters the board as a place where multiple actors, interests, and capabilities coexist. That complexity increases the likelihood of incidents, miscalculations, and escalatory triggers. The mechanism is escalation probability. Markets don't need a certainty of disruption. They need a credible path to disruption. Iraq's presence in the equation increases the number of paths. 10. Syria. Syria's role is the corridor and alignment layer of the conflict. It is often where regional alliances, proxy dynamics, and operational corridors intersect. The mechanism is persistence. Even when the visible news cycle slows, these corridors can sustain tension and keep the risk premium elevated. This is how conflicts remain expensive without constant headline events. 11. Lebanon. Lebanon enters the board because domestic fragility and regional conflict can overlap. Where state authority, armed actors, and border tensions intersect, the probability of escalation rises. Here the mechanism is accident risk as a driver of price. Energy markets respond harshly to the possibility of sudden escalation because it threatens routes and infrastructure planning, not because it is guaranteed, because it is not dismissible. 12. Turkey plus Egypt, one block by design. The script says 12 countries, but the system naturally pulls in more, so Turkey and Egypt are treated as a single block to keep the narrative frame intact. Turkey is pulled in through a combination of energy exposure, regional security dynamics, and the strategic need to manage spillover risk. Egypt is pulled in through stability and economics, regional diplomacy, route implications, and the domestic effect of energy price shocks. Neither country needs to be attacked to be affected. Their involvement is a function of how quickly the cost shock becomes domestic politics. And at this point in the story, it's worth saying out loud, the board doesn't stop at 12. This is simply the cleanest way to show the mechanism. Because on the edge of the board, a few more pieces start moving whether anyone wants them to or not. This is where the decision that cost billions becomes measurable. Not by counting missiles, by counting how the system reprices. Insurance, the first invoice. In maritime trade, insurance is often the first place reality shows up. When risk rises, premiums rise. The premium increase is not a political argument, it's a financial one. And when it rises, it flows into freight rates. Freight, the cost of moving everything goes up. Energy doesn't travel alone. If shipping in the region becomes more expensive or more constrained, the cost spreads to all cargo categories. The war begins charging goods that are not energy, because the logistics system is shared. Routing, stability becomes capacity. When ships reroute, you don't just pay more distance, you pay congestion, limited alternative capacity, scheduling disruption. In a tight logistics environment, small frictions scale. Refining, the consumer-facing bottleneck. Refining is where the price shock becomes political. If refined products tighten or become more expensive, governments face immediate public pressure. That pressure can change policy, subsidies, and even diplomatic posture. This is why refining sites and refining capacity occupy such an outsized place in the consequences. Risk premium, the tax that outlives the headline. The most enduring cost, is the risk premium that remains after the immediate moment passes. Markets can calm down quickly. But when a new precedent is set, when energy assets are proven vulnerable, the memory stays. That memory becomes a new baseline. Aftermath. What changes? Even if the conflict quiets down. When energy infrastructure becomes part of a conflict, the aftermath is rarely back to normal. It tends to produce structural shifts. 1. Permanent security posture around economic assets. Energy sites that were treated as industrial become treated as national security assets. That means more defense investment, more surveillance, more readiness. Those costs don't disappear when the news cycle moves on. 2. Supply chain strategy replaces pure efficiency. Governments and companies begin paying for redundancy, more storage, more diversified sourcing, more contractual flexibility, more route planning. Redundancy is expensive, but in a world where risk becomes credible, it becomes rational. Political sensitivity rises in importing countries. In countries exposed to price shocks, energy inflation becomes a domestic political force. That pressure shapes policy choices well beyond the region. The region's stability premium is reduced. For decades, the global system built assumptions into its pricing about the Gulf's continuity. When those assumptions weaken, the system doesn't collapse. It simply becomes more expensive. That's the long tail. The conflict's most durable victory isn't destruction. It's the cost of caution. China and Russia do not have to be the main actors to matter here. They matter because energy instability reshapes leverage. Russia tends to benefit strategically from higher energy prices and from the diplomatic friction that comes with supply uncertainty. It can use market dynamics as indirect influence. China, as a major importer and consumer, has a structural interest in predictable routes and stable supply. It responds through diplomacy, contracts, and long-term diversification efforts. Neither needs to fire a weapon to shift the board. In a system under stress, trade patterns and risk perception are tools. The story isn't that 12 countries chose to enter a war. The story is that once energy became a credible target set, the war stopped asking permission. It started pulling neighbors in through geography, pulling states in through airspace, pulling economies in through price, and pulling distant governments in through inflation. Ras Laffan and Mesaieed are not just Qatar. Jubail and SAMREF are not just Saudi Arabia. Hosn is not just the UAE. They're the points where a regional escalation becomes global cost. And when the world starts paying before a single tanker stops moving, the conflict has already crossed its most important border, the border between a war on a map and a war inside the system.